She was standing at the top of the porch steps when I pulled away, still wearing my father's cardigan. The one he used to wear every Saturday morning when he made pancakes. She didn't wave. She didn't even blink. She just watched me drive away with everything I owned stuffed into 2 garbage bags in the back seat, and I remember thinking, she must have planned this for a long time, because nobody that cold improvises. I was 22 years old. My father had been dead for 11 days. His name was Robert Callahan. He built a mid-sized software logistics company out of a basement in Oakville, Ontario, and sold it to a Toronto firm in 2019 for somewhere north of $40 million. He was not flashy about it. He still drove the same Ford pickup he'd had since I was in high school, still got his hair cut at the same barber shop on Kerr Street, still called me every Sunday at 6 o'clock without fail, no matter where either of us was. He called me his anchor. He said that a lot. "You're my anchor, Ethan." I used to roll my eyes when he said it. I would give anything to hear it now. His second wife's name was Renata. She came into our lives when I was 16, quiet and careful the way some people are when they're still figuring out what they can get away with. She had a son from a previous marriage, Marcus, who was 24 and had the handshake of a man who has never once done anything that required his hands. By the time my father got sick, pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by September, Renata had already spent 2 years slowly making herself the center of everything. She managed his calendar. She handled his correspondence. She drove him to his appointments and sat outside the door and told me he was too tired for visitors, even when I could see from the parking lot that Marcus's car was already there. I should have fought harder. I know that now. The will was read at a firm on Bay Street, one of those old offices with dark wood paneling and the kind of carpet that absorbs sound. I sat in a leather chair, and the lawyer, a man named Clifford Marsh, who had been my father's friend since law school, told me, with the same effect you'd use to describe a change in parking rates, that my father had updated his will 8 months prior, leaving the estate, the investments, the house in Oakville, and all liquid assets to Renata, with a provision for Marcus. My portion was a watch and a note. The note said, "I'm sorry, Ethan. You'll understand someday. The keys are in the desk drawer." I had no idea what desk drawer he meant. I had no idea what keys. I thought it was a mistake. I thought I was going to wake up. Clifford told me the house needed to be vacated within 30 days. Renata didn't come to the reading. She sent Marcus. I stayed with a friend in Hamilton for those first few weeks, sleeping on an air mattress in his spare room, eating cereal for dinner, trying to understand what had happened to my life. I applied for work. I went through my father's things, what little I'd managed to take before the locks were changed, and in the breast pocket of his old corduroy jacket I found a key. Small, brass, the kind that fits a safety deposit box or a padlock. There was a piece of masking tape on it with his handwriting. BFL, Storage Unit 14. BFL. I sat with that for 3 days before it hit me. Beaufort Lake. It was a place up in the Kawartha Highlands, north of Peterborough, maybe 3.5 hours from Hamilton. We'd gone there once. The summer I was 9, and stayed in a rented cottage. I remembered almost nothing about it except that my father had waded into the lake up to his knees and said, "Someday I'm going to buy a piece of land up here, and nobody is going to know where I am." I'd laughed. I thought he was joking. Why would a man who sold his company for $40 million own a storage unit in a rural area north of Peterborough? I drove up on a Thursday in October. The leaves were already past peak, brown and flat against the gravel shoulders of Highway 28, everything smelling of cold mud and wood smoke. I had the address of a storage facility in a town called Bancroft, which was the closest thing to a town in that area, population around 4,000. The facility was on a gravel road behind a Tim Hortons. The woman at the front desk looked at my key and my ID without much interest and pointed me toward the back row. Unit 14 had a combination padlock as well as the key lock. I stood there for a moment, genuinely stumped, and then I dialed in my father's birth date, November 3rd, 1964, and it opened on the first try. Inside was a plastic bin, a folding camp chair, and a locked metal box the size of a shoebox. I sat down on the camp chair in the middle of that concrete unit, with the door rolled up and the cold air coming in, and I opened the plastic bin first. Inside were two file folders, a USB drive taped to the inside lid, and a handwritten letter addressed to me. His handwriting was shaky. He must have written it during treatment, but it was his handwriting, unmistakable. "Ethan," it began, "if you found this, then the key worked. I'm glad. I need you to read everything in this folder before you open the box. Not because the box is dangerous, but because you need to understand the order of things." The first folder was a set of documents I didn't immediately understand. Financial statements. Two shell companies registered in New Brunswick. A paper trail connecting those companies to Clifford Marsh, the same lawyer who had read me my father's will on Bay Street. The second folder contained emails, printed emails, the kind you print when you're worried about digital evidence disappearing. They were between Renata and Clifford, dating back 4 years. My father had been collecting them since before the cancer diagnosis. He'd known something was wrong. He'd been building a record in secret, alone, because he hadn't known who to trust and he hadn't wanted to scare me before he was certain. The emails were about a will, specifically about replacing his will with a new version. Clifford had drafted the replacement. Renata had arranged for my father to sign it during a period when he was heavily medicated, 3 days after his second round of chemo, when he could barely form sentences. The witnesses on the new will were 2 employees from Clifford's firm who had signed off without question. My father had not, in any meaningful sense, chosen to cut me out. He had been deceived. He had been waiting for me to find this storage unit, to find this key, to find this letter, because he had known he might not live long enough to tell me himself. I sat in that folding camp chair for a long time, long enough for the light outside to shift from gray morning to gray afternoon. I didn't cry right away. It was more like a slow pressure in my chest, something becoming real in stages, the way ice thaws. He had known. He had been protecting me the only way he could from a hospital bed and a house he no longer controlled. There was still the locked metal box. The second key opened it. Inside was a USB drive, different from the one in the bin, a sealed legal envelope, and a handwritten index card that said, "Original will signed March 2017, notarized by Teresa Kovacs, Peterborough. USB contains voice recordings. Envelope contains correspondence with Kovacs. She knows you might be coming." I sat with the envelope in my hands, and I thought about Renata, standing on the porch steps in my father's cardigan. I thought about Clifford Marsh and his carpeted office and his even voice, reading me a will that had been forged, while my father was too sick to know what he was signing. And I thought, when nothing's left, you figure out what you're actually made of. I drove straight to Peterborough that evening. Teresa Kovacs was a notary in her late 50s who worked out of a small office above a dry cleaner's on George Street. When I called ahead from the road, she said, "I wondered when you'd come. Your father said it might take you a while." She had kept a copy of the original will. She had kept her notes from the signing. She had also kept, on her own initiative, a written record of a phone call she had received from Clifford Marsh's office the previous spring, asking her to confirm the original will had been destroyed. She had said yes, it had not been true. She had suspected something was happening, and she had kept everything. "Your father was one of the most careful men I've ever worked with," she told me, over terrible coffee in her tiny waiting room. "He knew exactly what he was doing when he came to me. He said, 'Teresa, if my son ever shows up here with a key in a box, please help him.' So here we are." I had the USB drives analyzed by a digital forensics consultant in Toronto, a woman my friend in Hamilton knew through her work in insurance claims. The voice recordings on the first drive were my father, alone, narrating what he'd discovered about Renata and Clifford, dated entries going back almost 2 years. His voice on those recordings was clearer than I'd expected. Focused, methodical. He was not a man who fell apart. We brought everything to a civil litigation lawyer named Anika Sharma, who had never heard my father's name in her life and had no reason to be anything other than completely on our side. She spent 2 weeks going through the file folders and the emails and the recordings and Teresa's notes, And then she called me into her office and said, "This is one of the cleaner fraud cases I've seen." They weren't subtle. The replacement will had been signed under circumstances that made it voidable, undue influence, a beneficiary's direct involvement in the drafting, and a signatory who had demonstrably lacked capacity at the time of signing. The original will, notarized in 2017, named me as primary beneficiary. Clifford Marsh resigned from his firm before the proceedings reached criminal referral. Marcus, who had been positioned to inherit a portion under the fraudulent will, retained his own lawyer and immediately began cooperating. I don't know what deal he made. I don't especially care. Renata's lawyer contacted Anika in the 6th week and began negotiating terms. The civil resolution took another 4 months. There were moments during that time when I was not sure I was going to make it through in any kind of functional shape. Financially, I was running on my friend's goodwill and a line of credit I'd had since university, and emotionally, I was doing something that I can only describe as surviving one day at a time. I did not allow myself to think past the next document, the next meeting, the next call with Anika. My father had done the hard part already. All I had to do was follow the map he'd left. The estate was returned to me in the spring. The Oakville house, the one I grew up in, had been partially renovated by Renata in the months after my father's death. I walked through it once, stood in the kitchen where he used to make those Saturday pancakes, and felt the particular coldness that comes from something being both familiar and wrong. I put it on the market 3 weeks later. A family from Mississauga bought it in May. I hope they make it a home again. With part of the proceeds, I paid back my friend every cent I owed him, including interest he had never asked for. The rest went into a trust Anika helped me set up, structured the way my father would have done it. Cautious, patient, for the long term. My father had also, it turned out, owned a small parcel of land near Beaufort Lake, 20 acres, bush and rock and a clearing with a view of the water. He'd bought it quietly in 2018, cash purchase, and never mentioned it to anyone. It was in the original will. I don't know exactly what he planned to do with it. Maybe he just needed something that was only his. I went up there in June, after everything was settled, and spent a weekend camping on the property. No cell signal, no noise except wind and water, and the occasional loon calling from somewhere across the lake. I sat at the water's edge on the second evening, and I thought about a man who had known he was losing time, who had sat down, carefully, methodically, despite everything, and built a way out for his son, hidden in a storage unit behind a Tim Hortons north of Peterborough. He was right that I'd understand someday. He was right about more than I gave him credit for most of my life. I'm going to build something on that land. A small cabin, maybe, nothing extravagant, nothing that needs a lot of maintenance. A place to be quiet. A place where the lake is the loudest thing. My father always said the best things in life don't require much upkeep, just attention. I think he meant that about more than property.